The gunmetal gray SUV rolled to a stop outside the glass doors of the most exclusive menswear boutique in the city, and before the engine had even settled, Kang Tae-min was already stepping out, adjusting the cuff of his black coat with the calm precision of a man who had never once in his life been made to wait for anything. Two men flanked him, silent, watching every window, every rooftop, every face on the sidewalk the way soldiers watch a battlefield. Tae-min did not look at them. He never needed to. Fear moved ahead of him like a shadow thrown by a sun no one could look at directly. He pushed through the boutique doors, and the staff inside straightened as if a current had passed through the room. A woman at the counter dropped her pen. The manager appeared from the back within seconds, bowing low, stammering a greeting that Tae-min waved away without breaking stride. He did not come here for conversation. He came here because his tailor had died 3 weeks ago, stabbed in an alley 2 blocks from his own shop, a message meant for Tae-min that had landed one man short of its target, and now Tae-min needed a new one, and he needed the world to see that nothing, not even blood spilled in his name, could slow him down. He was moving toward the racks of dark wool suits when he heard it. A child's laugh. High, unguarded, the kind of sound that did not belong anywhere near a man like him. He turned his head, and the whole room seemed to tilt. Near the far end of the boutique, close to the children's formalwear section he hadn't even known existed until this exact moment, stood a woman with her back to him, kneeling to fix the collar of a small boy in a miniature navy blazer. 2 other children, identical in height, in the shape of their small stubborn jaws, stood beside her, one tugging at her sleeve, the other spinning in slow circles just to watch his own reflection multiply in the mirrored walls. Tae-min's whole body went cold in a way that no threat, no blade, no rival syndicate had ever managed to make him feel. He knew that woman's shoulders. He knew the exact way she tilted her head when she was concentrating on something small and delicate. He had memorized that posture the way other men memorized scripture, back when he still believed he was allowed to keep things that were soft. Amara, he said, and the word left him before he had decided to speak it at all. The woman froze. Her hand stayed on the child's collar for one more second too long. Then she turned, slowly, and the boutique, the tailors, the guards, the mirrors, the racks of black wool, all of it fell away until there was nothing left in the world but her face, older now, sharper at the edges, more tired around the eyes, and still, impossibly, the most devastating thing he had ever looked at. Tae-min, she said. Not a greeting. An old wound reopening in real time. His eyes dropped, helplessly, to the 3 small faces now staring up at him with open, unafraid curiosity, 3 faces that shared her nose, her mouth, and something else. Something in the set of the eyes. Something that made his chest cave inward like a building losing its foundation all at once. He did the math before he wanted to. 6 years old, maybe closer to 5.5. 6 years since the night he had told her to run and never look back, since he had stood in a burning warehouse and chosen the war over the woman, since he had let her walk out of his life believing it was because he didn't love her enough, instead of the truth, that he loved her so much he was terrified of what his enemies would do to her if she stayed. They're beautiful, he heard himself say, though his voice sounded like it belonged to someone standing very far away. Amara's jaw tightened. She pulled the boy in the navy blazer half a step closer to her body, an instinct so old and so protective that it told Tae-min everything he needed to know before she said a single word more. Don't, she said quietly. Don't do that. Don't look at them like that. Behind him, one of his men shifted, unsure whether to step forward or fade back into the wallpaper. Tae-min lifted 2 fingers, a small and silent command, and both guards retreated toward the door without question, leaving him alone in the middle of the boutique with the only 3 human beings on earth who had ever made him forget, even for a second, that he was supposed to be dangerous. He looked at the tailors, at the manager still frozen mid-bow, at the racks of half-finished suits he had come here to buy. None of it mattered anymore. I need to talk to you, he said. There's nothing to talk about, Amara answered, but her voice cracked on the last word, and somewhere behind her the smallest of the 3 children, a girl, quieter than her brothers, with her mother's exact stubborn chin, tugged on her mother's coat and asked, in a small clear voice that cut through the entire boutique like a blade through silk. "Mommy, who is that man?" And Kang Tae-min, feared by 3 rival cartels, untouched by 4 assassination attempts, the man newspapers called the ghost because no bullet had ever managed to find him, that man stood frozen in a menswear boutique, unable to answer a 5-year-old's question, because he did not yet know if he was allowed to say the word that was clawing its way up his throat. Father. If your heart is already racing, if you already need to know what happens next, drop a comment right now that says "I'm still watching," and hit subscribe before this story pulls you somewhere you won't be able to look away from. There is a lot more coming, and every second of it earns the moment you just witnessed. To understand how a woman like Amara Adeyemi ended up standing in a designer boutique with 3 children who bore the unmistakable stamp of a man she'd spent 6 years trying to forget, you have to go back to the beginning, back before the warehouses and the warnings and the war that swallowed everything, back to a rooftop restaurant on a warm spring night when neither of them knew what the other one truly was. Amara had grown up in Lagos before her family relocated to the United States when she was 12, carrying with her a fierce independence that had been forged early, a father who worked 2 jobs, a mother who sewed dresses at night to make the difference, and a girl who learned quickly that nothing in this world would be handed to her. She built herself into a woman of sharp intelligence and sharper humor, someone who laughed loudly and argued louder, who had put herself through business school on scholarships and stubbornness, and who had, at 26, just landed her first real position managing luxury real estate acquisitions for a client whose name she did not yet know was a lie. Kang Tae-min had grown up in Seoul in a very different kind of house, one with marble floors and locked doors, where his father ran an empire built on things no one said out loud at the dinner table, and where Tae-min learned to read danger in a room the way other children learn to read picture books. His father groomed him for the family business from the time he could walk, and by the time he was 30 he had inherited not just wealth but war, a legacy of enemies who had been waiting for the old man to die so they could finally move against the sun. They met, absurdly, over a building. Tae-min had sent a representative to acquire a property downtown, a business front meant to launder something that never appeared on paper, and Amara had been assigned to handle the negotiation. When the numbers didn't add up the way they should have, when something about the buyer's paperwork made her stomach twist with instinct she couldn't yet name, she had insisted on meeting the principal himself instead of his lawyers. He had agreed, mostly out of curiosity about the woman who had the nerve to demand his time. She walked into that meeting expecting an arrogant investor. She found instead a man who listened more than he spoke, who asked her questions about her family and her ambitions like he actually wanted the answers, who had a stillness about him that unsettled her and drew her in at the exact same time. "You're not what I expected," she told him, halfway through their second meeting, which had somehow turned into dinner. "Neither are you," he said. "Most people are afraid of me before I say a word. Should I be?" He had looked at her for a long moment, something flickering behind his eyes that she would only understand the true weight of much later. "Yes," he said honestly. "But I hope you won't be." She wasn't. Not then. Not for a long time. What followed was 8 months that Amara would later describe, in the darkest corners of her memory, as the only time in her adult life she had ever felt completely unguarded. Tae-min took her to rooftop restaurants where he ordered in Korean and translated every word for her with an attentiveness that felt like devotion. He learned her coffee order without being told twice. He showed up outside her office in the rain holding an umbrella and an apology for a fight that had, in truth, been mostly his fault, and stood there until she let him in, both literally and otherwise. She met his mother, briefly, at a business function, a woman with eyes like winter who studied Amara from across the room with an expression Amara couldn't decode until much later, pity, she would eventually realize. Pity for a woman who didn't yet understand what she'd fallen into. She never met his father. His father had died 6 weeks before she and Tae-min ever crossed paths, and the empty throne his death left behind was the true reason Tae-min had been circling that building deal in the first place, trying to establish new footing in a legitimate business world while 3 separate factions inside his own organization jockeyed to either support him or replace him. She didn't know any of that. Not yet. To her, he was simply a man who had somehow, against every instinct she'd built to protect herself, become the center of her life. There was an evening, 4 months into their relationship, when Amara first sensed the shape of what she refused to name. Taemin had taken her to dinner at a quiet restaurant he claimed as neutral ground, and halfway through the meal 2 men in dark suits had approached their table, bowing low, murmuring something urgent in Korean before Taemin excused himself for what he called 5 minutes and returned 23 minutes later with his tie loosened and his jaw set like stone. "Everything all right?" she had asked. "Business," he said, too quickly, too smoothly, in a way that would have alarmed her if she hadn't already decided, somewhere deep down, that whatever answer he gave her was the one she wanted to hear. "Nothing that concerns you." She let it go. She let 100 small things go over those 8 months, the guards who trailed 2 steps behind him wherever they went and whom he introduced only as associates, the way certain restaurant owners went pale and attentive the moment he walked through their doors, the late-night phone calls he took in rooms with closed doors, always emerging afterward with an apology and a change of subject ready in the same breath. She told herself it was simply the price of loving a powerful man, that every wealthy family carried secrets, that she was choosing not to pry rather than choosing not to see. It would take the fire in that warehouse to finally show her the difference between the two. She got pregnant in the winter, 7 months into their relationship, and she remembered, with a clarity that still ached, the way his whole face had changed when she told him. Not panic. Not calculation. Just a raw, unguarded joy so foreign to his usual composure that she had almost laughed at how young he suddenly looked. Twins, the doctor told them at the 12-week appointment, and then, at the anatomy scan 2 months later, corrected herself with wide eyes. "I'm so sorry, I need to look again. There are 3 heartbeats. Triplets. 2 boys and a girl, tangled together the way they had apparently been tangled together from nearly the beginning, refusing even before birth to be separated from one another." Taemin had gone quiet in the ultrasound room, staring at the screen, and Amara had reached for his hand, terrified for one long second that the shock was too much, that this was where it would all fall apart. Instead he had turned to her, eyes wet in a way she had never seen before and would never see again, and said, "I didn't know I was allowed to have this." She hadn't understood what he meant. Not fully. Not until the night, 5 months later, when the life she thought she knew burned down around her in the most literal sense possible. It was a Tuesday. She remembered that detail with strange, useless clarity, that it was a Tuesday, that she had made kimchi jjigae for dinner because she'd been trying to learn to cook the foods he grew up with, that she was 7 months pregnant and her ankles hurt and she had just sat down on the couch when Taemin's phone rang and his entire posture changed in an instant, the mask she rarely saw slamming down over his face like a door. "Stay here," he told her. "Lock everything. Don't open the door for anyone but me." "Taemin, you're scaring me." "I need you to trust me," he said, already moving toward the door, already someone else entirely, someone she had glimpsed only in shadows before that night. "Please. Just trust me." She trusted him. She locked the door. She waited 2 hours that felt like 2 years, and when he finally returned, his shirt was torn at the collar and there was a graze along his jaw that he refused to explain, and behind him in the driveway sat a car she didn't recognize, engine running, a stranger's silhouette waiting behind the wheel. "I need you to go with him," Taemin said, gesturing at the car, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice was shaking. "Just for a little while. Until this settles." "Until what settles? What is happening?" And that was the night he finally told her, not everything, never everything, but enough. Enough about his father, about the empire, about the rival faction that had just tried to burn down one of his warehouses with 12 of his men inside it as a message that the son could not hold what the father had built. Enough for the floor of her entire life to open up beneath her feet. "You lied to me," she whispered. "For 8 months. You let me fall in love with you and you let this," she gestured at her own swollen stomach, at the life growing inside her that belonged half to a man she suddenly wasn't sure she knew at all, "happen, and you never told me what you actually were." "I was going to," he said. "I swear to you, I was going to find the right moment." "There is no right moment for this, Taemin. There's no version of this where you tell me the truth and it doesn't destroy everything. I know, he said, and something in his voice broke entirely. I know that. And I need you to go anyway. Because if you stay, they will use you against me. They will use our children against me. The only way I can protect any of you is if you disappear where they can't find you, and the only way I can end this war is if I'm not distracted by fear for the people I love most. Don't call it protecting me, she said, tears streaming freely now, when what you're actually doing is choosing them over us. I am choosing you, he said, his voice breaking on every word. I am choosing you by letting you go. Do you understand that? If I keep you close, I bury you. If I let you go, you live. Please, Amara. Please just live. She had climbed into that car with her hand pressed against her stomach, staring at him through the rear windshield as the driveway pulled away and his figure grew smaller and smaller, standing alone in front of a house she would never see again, and she had made herself a promise in that moment, a promise that would carry her through 6 years of building a life from nothing in a country she had to disappear into, changing her last name, changing her city, changing everything except the three faces that grew inside her and were eventually born 2 months later in a small hospital 3 states away, delivered by a doctor who never once asked why the woman in front of her had no family listed as emergency contacts. She named them herself. Chitty, Keen, and the girl, Adiz, strong names that belonged fully to her, names with no trace of the man who had put her in that car and vanished from her life like smoke. She built a business from scratch, an interior design firm that started with word-of-mouth clients and grew, slowly, painfully, into something stable enough to support 4 people. She never dated. She never let herself get close to anyone, not because she was still in love with a ghost, she told herself, over and over, that she wasn't, but because trust had become a language she no longer knew how to speak fluently. And today, on an ordinary Tuesday 6 years later, buying her sons their first real suits for a cousin's wedding, she had turned around in a boutique and found the ghost standing in front of her in the flesh, staring at the children he didn't know existed with an expression that told her, in one devastating second, that everything she had spent 6 years running from had just caught up to all of them at once. They're mine, Taemin said. It wasn't a question. Amara's hands were shaking as she pulled all 3 children closer, an instinct so deep it bypassed thought entirely. They don't know you, she said. They have never known you. And I intend to keep it that way. Amara. You put me in a car, Taemin. You sent me away pregnant with triplets and you never once tried to find me. I did try, he said, his voice raw in a way she had never heard from him, not even that final night. For years, I tried. Every channel I had, every resource, every favor I could call in, you vanished so completely I started to believe you'd wanted it that way. I told myself that was your right. That you deserved to build a life free of everything I brought into yours. So I stopped looking, because I thought looking was just another way of hurting you. And now? Now I'm standing in front of the family I didn't know I still had, he said, and his composure, the composure that had held through gunfire, through betrayal, through the death of his own father, finally cracked completely, right there among the racks of half-finished suits. And I am not walking away from them a second time. Not even if it kills me. If that hit you the way it hit them, comment I'm still watching one more time and make sure you're subscribed, because the story is only getting more intense from here, and I promise you, what happens next will change everything you think you understand about both of them. The days that followed cracked Amara's carefully built world down the middle. Taemin did not disappear, as she had half expected, half feared he would once the shock wore off. Instead he called. He waited outside her office, not to intimidate, but simply to be seen, standing at a respectful distance until she was ready to acknowledge him. He sent no gifts, no grand gestures, none of the performative wealth she might have expected from a man who could buy anything. He asked, instead, for the one thing money couldn't purchase, time. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he told her, the 3rd time she agreed to see him, in a quiet corner of a coffee shop far from her office, far from anywhere their history might attract attention. I'm asking for the chance to know them. Even from a distance, if that's all you can give me. You have no idea what it cost me, Amara said, her voice low and tight, to build a life where they never had to know what kind of world their father came from. Where they never had to be afraid of a knock at the door. Do you know what I told them, when they asked about you? I told them their father died before they were born. I made you a ghost so they wouldn't have to grow up in the shadow of one. Taemin absorbed that the way a man absorbs a blade, visibly, without flinching, because the pain was earned and he knew it. I left that world, he said quietly. After the warehouse. After you. It took 3 years, but I dismantled everything my father built that wasn't legal, and I burned every bridge to the parts of it I couldn't dismantle. I run real estate now. Legitimate development. The men who came with me today are private security, not soldiers, a precaution, not a lifestyle. I did it because I promised myself that if I ever found you again, I wanted to be a man you could actually let back into your life. Not the one who put you in that car. She wanted, desperately, not to believe him. Belief was dangerous. Belief was the thing that had nearly gotten her killed once already. But over the following weeks, belief crept in anyway, in small unglamorous proofs. He showed up to a business meeting with her lawyer, not his, and answered every question about his past with unsettling honesty, holding nothing back even when honesty cost him. He requested supervised visits only, insisting the children's comfort came before his own need to be near them. He learned, without being told, that Chitty was allergic to peanuts and that Keen hated loud noises and that Adiz only fell asleep if someone hummed a specific lullaby, because he sat quietly in the corner of Amara's living room during bath time and dinner time and bedtime, absorbing every detail of the family he had missed building. The children, for their part, were cautiously, devastatingly curious about him. Chitty, the oldest by 4 minutes and the boldest by nature, was the first to ask him direct questions, what his job was, why he talked differently, whether he knew how to play soccer. Keen watched him with quiet suspicion for weeks before finally, one evening, climbing into his lap uninvited during a movie and falling asleep there within 20 minutes, an act of trust that made Taemin go completely still, afraid to move even his breathing for fear of breaking the moment. Adiz took the longest. She watched him from behind her mother's legs for over a month, saying nothing, until one afternoon in the park, when Taemin knelt down at her eye level instead of towering over her, and told her, gently, that he was sorry he had missed so much of her life, and that he understood if she wasn't ready to call him anything at all. Mommy said you were a ghost, Adiz said finally, studying him with an intensity that startled him with how much it resembled her mother's. I understand why she said that, Taemin answered carefully. I was gone for a very long time. But I'm not a ghost. I'm real. And I would very much like the chance to know you, if you'll let me. Adiz considered this with the terrible gravity only a 5-year-old can summon, then reached out and took his hand, not fully, not a hug, not a declaration, just 3 small fingers wrapped briefly around one of his, before running off to the swings without another word. Taemin sat frozen on that park bench for a long time afterward, and when Amara found him there, unmoving, she realized with a jolt that he was crying, silently, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere so deep it doesn't make a sound. She held my hand, he said, when he noticed her watching. For 3 seconds. She held my hand. Amara sat down beside him, further away than she might have once, but closer than she'd let herself get to any man in 6 years. You don't get to undo what you did, she said quietly. I want to be clear about that. 6 years is 6 years. You missed their first steps, their first words, their first Christmas. Nothing erases that. I know, he said. But, she continued, and her voice wavered on the word, watching you with them these past weeks. Watching you learn them, actually learn them, not perform for them, it's making it very hard to keep hating you the way I've spent 6 years training myself to. He turned to look at her then, something fragile and hopeful breaking through the exhaustion on his face. I'm not asking you to stop being angry, he said. I'm asking if there's room, somewhere underneath the anger, for something else to grow too. For them. And maybe, eventually, if you'd ever let me try, for us. The intensity built as autumn turned toward winter, when the past Taemin thought he'd buried clawed its way back into the present in the most terrifying way possible. A man named Sun-ho, one of the last surviving lieutenants from the rival faction that had once tried to burn Taemin's empire to the ground, resurfaced after years underground, having learned, through channels Taemin still didn't fully understand, that the ghost had reunited with a woman and 3 children in the United States. It was, to a man like Sun-ho, not a reunion. It was leverage. The threat arrived not as violence, at first, but as a photograph, slipped into Amara's mailbox with no note attached, a photograph of Chitty, Keen, and Adiz at their school playground, taken from a distance with a long lens, clearly meant to communicate one single, devastating message: I know exactly where they are, and I can reach them whenever I choose. Amara's hands shook so violently when she called Taemin that she could barely hold the phone. They found them, she said, before he'd even finished saying hello. Someone took a photo of our children at school, Taemin, someone is watching them. He was at her house in 11 minutes. She would remember that detail forever too, 11 minutes, because she had been counting every single one of them, standing at her front window with a kitchen knife in her trembling hand because it was the only thing that had felt remotely like protection. This is exactly what I promised would never happen again, Taemin said, his voice a low current of fury and fear so tightly controlled it frightened her more than if he'd screamed. This is exactly why I let you go the first time. So what do we do? She demanded. Do I disappear again? Do I take them and run and spend another 6 years hiding, except this time they're old enough to remember it, old enough to ask why their father found them just in time to lose them again? No, Taemin said, and something in his voice had shifted into a register she hadn't heard since that night 6 years ago, the register of a man who had once run an empire and had not entirely forgotten how. No. This time we don't run. This time I end it. Properly. Completely. So that no one ever has the ability to send a photograph like this again. Taemin, don't you dare do something that gets you killed and leaves them fatherless twice. I won't, he said, gripping her hands, forcing her to look at him. I promise you, Amara, on everything I have left, I am not going to lose you a second time. But I need you to trust me one more time. Just one more time. And this time, I am not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to stay close, where I can protect all of you myself, instead of trying to protect you by pushing you away. I understand now that was the mistake. Distance never protected you. It only left you defenseless. There was a night, early in those 3 weeks, when Amara nearly broke entirely. It was almost midnight, and Chitty had woken from a nightmare he couldn't fully explain, something about a man standing at the edge of the school fence, and by the time she had calmed him back to sleep her own hands wouldn't stop shaking. She sat on the floor outside his bedroom door, back against the wall, and let herself cry the way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in 6 years, not when she'd been alone in a hospital room delivering 3 babies with no family beside her, not when she'd worked 18-hour days trying to build a business out of nothing, not even on the loneliest nights when she'd wondered if she had made the wrong choice walking into that boutique with her guard down. Taemin found her there when he arrived to relieve the overnight security detail. He didn't say anything at first. He simply sat down on the floor beside her, in his $3,000 coat. On the hallway carpet of a house that would never in 100 years have belonged in his old world, and let the silence hold both of them. I keep thinking, Amara finally said, that I did this to them. That if I had just stayed hidden, if I had never let you back into that boutique, they would still be safe, still be ordinary children who had never had to be afraid of a stranger's camera. They were never ordinary, Taemin said quietly. Not because of anything I did. Because of everything you built for them. You gave them a life so stable, so full of love, that they don't even know how to recognize fear when it shows up. That's why Chitty couldn't explain the nightmare. He's never had to learn that language. That's not something to blame yourself for, Amara. That's the proof of everything you did right. And if something happens to them, she whispered, because you came back into our lives. Then it will be the single greatest failure of my entire existence, he said, and his voice cracked on the words in a way that told her he meant it completely, and I will spend whatever life I have left trying to make it right, even knowing I never could. But I am not going to let that happen. I have spent my whole life learning exactly how men like Sung-ho think, exactly what they're capable of and exactly what stops them. Let me use that. Let the very thing that once cost you everything be the thing that finally protects you completely. She didn't answer him in words that night. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder, exhausted past the point of pride, and let him carry some of the weight she had carried entirely alone for 6 long years. There was another moment, weeks later, when the tension nearly shattered everything they'd rebuilt, a night when Taemin came back from a meeting with a split lip and refused, at first, to explain how he'd gotten it, and Amara, terrified and furious in equal measure, screamed at him in her own kitchen that she would not raise her children to watch their father disappear into violence the way she'd once watched him disappear into a burning warehouse. You promised me this life was over, she said, tears streaking her face. You promised me, Taemin. It is over, he said, holding perfectly still so as not to frighten her further. This, he gestured at his own bruised jaw, this was the last of it settling its accounts, not the beginning of something new. I know that's not enough to make you feel safe right now. I know I've asked you to trust me on faith more times than any person should reasonably be asked to. But I need you to understand everything I am doing, every risk I am taking, is in service of making sure I never have to ask you to trust me on faith again. Once this is finished, there will be nothing left to explain away. No split lips. No secrets. Just us. She had wanted, desperately, to walk away from him again that night. Every instinct she had built over 6 years screamed at her to protect her children from a life that still, even in its final unraveling, could reach into her kitchen and lead blood on a man's collar. But she looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the boy who had once let fear make his choices for him, sending her away in a car in the middle of the night, but a man choosing, deliberately and at enormous personal cost, to stand and fight for the family he had once run from. This is the last time, she said finally. The very last time I let you carry something like this without telling me everything. The last time, he agreed. I swear it. For 3 unbearable weeks, security surrounded the children everywhere, school, the park, even their own front yard, while Taemin worked behind the scenes with a precision that reminded Amara, uncomfortably, of exactly what kind of man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. He met with contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. He called in debts he'd hoped never to collect. He negotiated, and where negotiation failed, he made it unmistakably clear through channels Amara chose not to ask too many questions about, that anyone who came near his family would be answered with a force he had spent 6 years trying to leave behind, but had never actually lost. The resolution, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic in its quiet finality, a meeting in a private room that Amara was never told the details of, after which Sung-ho was never heard from again in connection with either of them, and the photograph in Amara's mailbox became the only threat that ever arrived. But the toll it took was not anticlimactic at all. Amara watched Taemin return from that final meeting looking 10 years older, his hands trembling in a way she had never once seen from him, and she understood in that moment, with total clarity, exactly what it had cost him to walk back into that world one last time, purely to guarantee his children would never have to know it existed. It's over, he told her, sitting in her kitchen at 2 in the morning, unable to look up from his own hands. Truly over. I burned the last bridge tonight. There is nothing left connecting me to who I used to be. I have nothing left to protect them with except who I am now. Amara crossed the kitchen and did something she hadn't let herself do in 6 years. She put her hand against the side of his face, gently, the way she used to, back before warehouses and burning buildings and cars and driveways. Then who you are now, she said softly, is going to have to be enough. Because I think, her voice caught, I think I'm ready to let it be enough. Winter turned into spring, and the family that had been broken apart on one terrible Tuesday slowly, carefully, rebuilt itself on entirely different terms. Taemin did not move in immediately. Amara insisted on that, insisted on rebuilding trust in careful, deliberate stages rather than rushing back into a life together out of fear and relief and unresolved love all at once. But he was there for every dinner. He learned to make jollof rice under Amara's mother's strict long-distance video instructions, burning it twice before finally getting it right, to the triplets' delighted laughter. He coached Chitty's soccer team on weekends. He sat through Keen's entire, elaborate explanation of a dinosaur documentary without once looking at his phone. He learned the lullaby Adiz needed to fall asleep, and one night, when Amara was away at a client dinner, he hummed it himself, off-key and unpracticed, until his daughter drifted off in his arms for the first time in her life. A year after the boutique, on the anniversary of the day their entire lives had collided again without warning, Taemin stood in that same shopping district, though not that same store, and slipped a ring into his coat pocket before taking his family, all four of them, out for dinner at the small Korean restaurant that had become their weekly tradition. He did not propose that night. He had learned enough, by then, to understand that some things could not be rushed back into existence after being broken so badly. But he carried the ring for months afterward, waiting for a moment that felt earned rather than performed, and when that moment finally came, quiet, ordinary, unremarkable in every way except that it was theirs, Amara said yes with none of the hesitation that had once defined every conversation about their future. What Amara understood, in the end, standing in front of the mirror on her wedding day with 3 children who insisted on being part of every single stage of the preparation, was that some losses are not endings at all, no matter how final they feel in the moment they happen. Some losses are simply the shape love takes on its way to becoming something stronger, something that has survived enough to know exactly what it's protecting and exactly what it's worth. She had spent 6 years believing she had lost everything the night that car pulled out of the driveway. She hadn't lost everything. She had simply been carrying, all along, 3 small proofs that love,